Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6 is where we're going to be. And this morning we're going to continue in our teaching story, or our series about our favorite Bible stories. And today we're going to be in Daniel chapter 6, and we're going to look at the story of Daniel and the lion's den. The story of Daniel and the lion's den doesn't begin in Daniel chapter 6. It actually begins way before that. It begins much earlier, around 586 BC. Because in 586 BC, a Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar began to invade Israel. And he would come and he would take part of Israel, and he would take those captive who were in it. He would take all the able-bodied people back to Babylon. And he wouldn't just take them to be slaves. He would take them and he would have the purpose of re-educating them. He wanted to make them Babylonians. And some of the fittest and the finest of the young men, his goal was to take back and train them so that they would be leaders in all of Babylon. So he began in 586 was that first conquest, and he took some of those. And then later he would take some others. And around 605 BC, he took a guy named Daniel. And Daniel was a young Jewish man. And he took him and he decided that was one of the ones he was going to make a leader out of. So he wanted to feed him well. And he would take these guys and he would give them the best food and he would give them the best education. And his whole time was that he wanted them to be exactly what he wanted them to be. He was going to work in their minds and educate them to be Babylonians. So now Daniel's a captive in Babylon. And Daniel was schooled in the best of Babylonian schools. But at the same time, Daniel was very careful to follow the law of God. In fact, in chapter 1, when he was taken captive, they took these young men and they said, we're going to give you the best meats and the king's wine, and you're going to have the richest of foods. But Daniel knew that those rich foods wasn't what God had told his people to eat, and he would be honoring God by eating that. So he issued a challenge, and he said, will you allow me for a certain period of time, will you allow us to eat the food that we normally eat? And if it proves that we're not as healthy as those who are eating the king's food, then we'll eat the king's food. Well, God worked in their lives to where eating God's food, they were healthier. So Daniel had set the standard. He was going to follow God, even though he was in this faraway land, and even though he was really a captive in Babylon. Throughout time, God continued to bless Daniel, and it became obvious that Daniel had God's favor. And the kings and the leaders would realize that this guy was blessed because he was following his God. And Daniel began to rise in the ranks and in leadership in all of Babylon. Well, over time, King Nebuchadnezzar died. And after his death, another nation began to come, and they overthrew Babylon. And it became an army of the Medes and the Persians together. And they came and they conquered and they became the leaders. So now Daniel finds himself as a servant of Darius the Mede. Verse 1 and verse 2 of chapter 6 tells us that Darius appointed 120 satraps. That would be kind of like what we would call governors. And he would put them all over the province and throughout his land. And these 120, out of them he appointed 3 who were administrators. And the 120 would report to the 3, and the 3 would report to the king. And one of those that he appointed administrator was Daniel. Verse 3 tells us how well Daniel was thought of by the king. So let's look at that together. Daniel chapter 6 verse 3 says, this man Daniel distinguished himself among the other officials and satraps because there was an extraordinary spirit in him. The king thought about putting him in charge of the whole kingdom. So this Daniel was so well thought of, even though he was a foreigner in the land, that the king was actually going to put him in charge of all the kingdom. Now that's great for Daniel, but can you imagine how those other guys felt? You imagine how all those Babylonians felt when all of a sudden the guy who could be second in charge right under the king was a foreigner in their land. And now the king is going to make this foreigner in charge of all. Could you imagine? We see it often in our lives. When maybe someone gets a promotion, Or someone is showing favor over someone else. And we'll get a little jealous, don't we? We'll get a little upset. Well, these guys became very jealous. They were unhappy, and they wanted to do something to make Daniel look bad. And they wanted to find something where they could find fault in Daniel, just to make it so that he didn't look as good as he was. But look what it says in verse 4. Chapter 6, verse 4 says, "So the other officials and satraps tried to find something to accuse Daniel of in his duties for the kingdom, but they couldn't find anything wrong because he was trustworthy. No error or fault could be found in him." And that verse takes us to the first thought I want to leave with you this morning. And that first thought is this, is Daniel lived his life above reproach. In his life, Daniel lived his life above reproach. They tried to find fault in him. But our scripture says no fault was found in him. They couldn't find anything. Now, could you imagine today? Let's take the story of Daniel and let's put it in 2021. If they were trying to find fault in Daniel today, what would they do? Well, they probably would go talk to his friends. But if they went and talked to his friends and all his friends says, "We can't tell you anything wrong about him." Or maybe they'd watch the surveillance cameras at his workplace to see something he was lacking. But there was nothing. Or maybe if this story was today, they'd pull his search history off of his laptop just to see what he'd been looking at. But no matter what they did, they found nothing wrong in Daniel's life. No fault was found in him. He lived his life above reproach. He lived his life in a way so that they couldn't find anything wrong because it wasn't there. He didn't go about being one person by day and another by night. He wasn't this person when he was with his Jewish friends and this person with the Babylonians. Daniel lived his life above reproach. So when they tried to find something, there wasn't anything. So if there's nothing there, but you really want to get him in trouble, what do you have to do? You have to make something up for yourselves. You have to make it up. So that's what they did. And I want to kind of give you an idea of what they did, but I need some help with that. So if all of our kids could come and help me, we're going to show the adults how they can make something up on Daniel. All right, so you guys come forward. Good morning, everybody. We are going to have fun today. Because here's what we're going to do. We're going to get somebody in trouble. Okay, so you look around. I want you to figure out who are we going to get in trouble. Okay, so pick one of these folks out here. Who are we going to get in trouble? Annie?
Yeah.
Okay, y'all will get Annie in trouble?
Yeah.
Okay. Now let me ask you. Is Annie normally a good girl? Kind of. Oh, well, let's say yes, okay? Because she's normally, but today, we're going to get her in trouble. So we have to think of something that we can trick her into getting in trouble, okay? So what does Annie like to do?
Do Snapchat?
She likes to do Snapchat. Does she usually do that at church? No? Okay, well, thank you. You just be okay. So we have to think of something that we know that she would do in church. I got an idea. Smile. Okay? You ever seen Annie smile? She's got a pretty smile, doesn't she? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to make a rule that it's against the law to smile in church. Because we know she can't help it. I mean, just the thought. She can't help it, okay? So we made a rule. So as Pastor Dan, I declare that it is against the rules today to smile in church. And anyone who smiles in church will be in trouble. Okay, does that sound like a good rule? Yeah. Okay, that's the rule. That's our rule today. Anybody who smiles in church, we're doing this because we know Annie likes to smile, okay? So we got to find out something to get her in trouble so that she can break the rules. So I got an idea. You ready? Now, Annie will know what this is, okay? You ready? Baby, And Annie had to smile. She's still smiling. She must really love me. You couldn't have stopped me. But that's kind of what they did to Daniel. They knew Daniel was going to worship his God. So they had to come up with something that they knew he was going to do anyway. And they said, let's make a rule. King, why don't you make a rule that nobody prays to anybody but you? And they did. The king says, that's a good idea. And he made this rule, and Daniel went ahead and prayed to his God 3 times a day. And that's what they did. So what you guys have just done is you showed me, using Annie, how they tricked Daniel to get him in trouble. So let's give them all a hand this morning. Thank you all. I'm glad they picked you, Andy. It would have been a whole lot harder to do that for Pastor Nathan. You know, they knew that what Daniel was going to do, because Daniel lived his life above reproach. So they had to deceive. Now let me ask you, in our lives, do we ever face deceptive people? Sure, they're everywhere. And from the story, I want to show you 3 signs of somebody being deceptive. Sign number 1. Deceptive people pretend to speak for the whole group. It'll happen almost every time. Deceptive people will pretend to speak for the whole group. I remember one time in our church, in the middle of worship service, somebody stands to their feet and says, I speak for everybody here. And after the service was over, these folks all kept coming when they didn't speak for me. I don't think that way. That wasn't my thought. But in their mind, because they were being deceived, they were saying, I speak for everybody. They devised a plan. And it says that they all went to the king, but they wanted him to think that they were speaking for everybody. The first part of verse 7 says this. All the officials, governors, satraps, advisors, and mayors agreed. Now, did they all agree? No. Daniel wasn't even consulted. No, Daniel wasn't a part of that vote. But when they come, they said, we speak for everybody. We all agree, but Daniel wasn't even there. And he was one of the top of the leadership. Many folks today, I think, do that in their deception without even realizing it. I've been pastor and in ministry for over 25 years now. And I can tell you, I see a lot of stuff where folks will try to be deceptive. And I've heard a lot of things. But I can tell you one line, I've lost count of how many times I've heard it. And it's, several people have said to me, or I've heard several people, or I love this one, several people came to me in the parking lot. Did you know all official church business has to take place in the parking lot? I didn't either. But I get that all the time. And here's what I find out. Sometimes several people is 2. Sometimes several people is 3. Sometimes it's 5. Sometimes it's 10. But several people, it's never everybody. It's never all. Because deceptive people pretend to speak for the whole group. And they'll be deceptive in that way. The second sign of being deceptive that I find here is deceptive people use flattery to sway their subject. Notice how these guys come to the king. Now this was the official greeting, so you're going to see Daniel do it later. But they emphasize this. Oh king, live forever. And as they come to the king, they come and, oh king, live forever. And that's how they would greet the king. Well, can you imagine? You're the king of this kingdom that rules almost the whole world. Or the whole world as you know it. And your subjects coming, and they're not just coming with, oh king, they're bowing down with their face on the ground before you, and they're, oh king, live forever. Can you imagine that ego? It just keeps swelling and swelling and swelling. Oh king, live forever. We think you are so awesome. And we think you are so great that we've all agreed that you need to make a rule, a decree. And that decree is that for the next 30 days, nobody can bow down or worship or pray to anything but you. Because they've kind of flattered and built that king up, and I can just picture them going, yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think that's what you should do. If that's what everybody thinks, then let's do it. I I'll make a decree, and that's what we'll do. Now, you're all sitting there giving me this look like we'd never do that. Well, we'd never be a part of that. But I also want to hear things like, Pastor Dan, I really like your preaching. Or I hear, Pastor Dan, I love you and your family. Or, Pastor Dan, you've really done a good job at the church. And like I say, I've been in ministry a long time. I know what comes next. That's always followed with a but. Pastor Dan, we love your preaching, but. We love you and your family, but. You've done a great job at our church, but. Because there's something else coming. Now you have to read the whole story here of David to see the but. But they're coming to the king, and they're using flattery. Oh, king, live forever. You're so great. You're so awesome. We think nobody, we all agree. Nobody should bow down to anybody but you. Deceptive people use flattery to sway their subjects. And the third thing I see from this story that always holds true is deceptive people pretend to be innocent of all wrongdoing. Now you kind of have to jump ahead in the story a little bit to see that. Daniel's going to go ahead and pray like he always does to his God. They're going to come in and catch him because they know when he prays. And then they're going to go to the king. But look what it says in verses 12 and 13. Then they went and spoke to the king about his decree. They asked, didn't you sign the decree which stated that for 30 days, whoever asks for anything from any god or person except you, your majesty, will be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, that's true. According to the law of these persons, the decree can't be repealed. They replied, your majesty, Daniel, one of the captives of Judah, refuses to obey your order or the decree that you signed. He prays 3 times each day. And you can imagine him here going, okay, you signed that most wonderful decree. And that most wonderful decree, Daniel broke it. He's praying. He's praying 3 times. Those deceivers went to the king to take them the story so they'd get Daniel in trouble. How did they know the plan would work? I believe there's 2 things they counted on. One was the king's ego. And number 2 is my second thought this morning. And my second thought is Daniel was predictable in his faith. I think we need to see here that Daniel was predictable. Look at verse 10. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went to his house. An upper room in his house had windows that opened in the direction of Jerusalem. 3 times each day he got down on his knees and prayed to his God. He had always praised God this way. How did they know that Daniel would break the rule about only praying to the king or bowing down to the king? Because Daniel was predictable in his faith. They knew that Daniel prayed 3 times a day. And they knew that no matter what happened, no matter what that decree was, Daniel would not deny his God and he would continue to pray 3 times a day. Now I want you to notice something here. Daniel didn't make a show about it. It said Daniel went to his house and he went to an upper room that had a window that faced Jerusalem. So Daniel wasn't like standing in the street making this, oh Lord, here I am among these heathens. I'm here to call out to you even though I'm not supposed to. Hey, he wasn't making a show of himself. Too many times as Christians, everything we do is for show. Daniel was satisfied with an audience of 1 instead of the audience of many. And when we look at it, he calls out. So he wasn't making a show about it, but he didn't hide his faith either. He went to his house. It had a window that faced Jerusalem. He opened the window. And 3 times a day he continued to pray. Just as he always had done. In 1 Kings, we find the prayer that Solomon prayed in dedication to the temple. And it's a great prayer for you to read. As you follow through that prayer, you get down to about verse 48. And there in verse 48, Solomon prays this. He prays that God's people, even when they're in captivity, would realize their wrongdoing and turn their hearts toward Jerusalem and pray to the God of that temple. Daniel was just obedient. He was predictable in his faith. They knew Daniel would be praying at this time every day. So they went in and caught him praying because he was predictable. You know, I wonder this morning, how predictable are we in our faith? Oh, well, let me put it this way. If someone is going to accuse you of being a Christian, is there enough genuine evidence there to find you guilty? Now, I say genuine because I think there are a lot of folks who fake Christianity. They're one thing when they come to church. We'll sing, oh, how I love Jesus. But then we go home and we're totally something else. Or we go to work where the guys are or the gals are and we act just like them. So I think there are a lot of fakes who pretend to be a Christian. But genuinely, if someone was to accuse you of being a Christian, is there enough genuine evidence to find you guilty? Daniel was predictable in his faith. They knew Daniel. And they knew that 3 times a day, this time, Daniel would go to his room, open the window, and pray toward Jerusalem. They knew he'd do it. And they knew that's how they could trick him up. Daniel went and prayed. So they went to the king. And, oh, king, live forever. You know that rule you made, that awesome rule? Daniel broke it. The king had no choice. He had signed the decree, sealed it with his ring. Whoever broke the decree was to be cast into the lion's den. So he had no choice. He didn't want to. Daniel was his good friend. But he made the rule and he couldn't break it. Have Daniel brought here, cast him in the lion's den. Well, let's pick up the story there. Chapter 6, verse 16. So the king gave the order, and Daniel was brought to him and thrown into the lion's den. The king told Daniel, may your God, whom you always worship, save you. A stone was brought and placed over the opening of the den. The king put a seal on the stone using his ring and the rings of his nobles so that Daniel's situation could not be changed. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night without food or company. He couldn't get to sleep. At dawn, as soon as it was light, the king got up and quickly went to the lion's den. As he came near the den where Daniel was, the king called to Daniel with anguish in his voice. Daniel, servant of the living God, was God whom you always worship able to save you from the lions? Daniel said to the king, Your Majesty, may you live forever. My God has sent an angel to shut the lion's mouth so that they couldn't hurt me. He did this because he considered me innocent. Your Majesty, I haven't committed any crime. The king was overjoyed and had Daniel taken out of the den. When Daniel was taken out of the den, people saw that he was completely unharmed because he trusted his God. The king ordered those men who had brought the charges against Daniel to be brought to him. They, their wives, their children were thrown into the lion's den. Before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions attacked them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to the people of every province, nation, and language all over the world, I wish you peace and prosperity. I decree that in every part of my kingdom, people should tremble with terror in front of Daniel's God, the living God who continues forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed. His power lasts to the end of time. He saves, rescues, and does miraculous signs and amazing things in heaven and on earth. He saved Daniel from the lions. This man Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. This takes us to our last thought today. And our last thought is this. When you live your life above reproach, and when you're predictable in your faith, God will be glorified and others will come to him. Because Daniel was willing to live his life above reproach, and because he was predictable in his faith, in the end, God got the glory. And others come to know God. The king couldn't change his plan. You notice there it said, the king said, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians. The Medes and the Persians had a law. And the law was if the king signed a decree and sealed that with his seal, then that decree could not be changed no matter what. Later we find that comes into play when Ezra comes back and they're going to rebuild the temple. We find one king signed a decree, the other one couldn't change it, because it was the law of the Medes and the Persians. So even though he didn't want to, by decree, he had to throw Daniel in the lion's den. That had to be done. He couldn't back out on that law. He couldn't say, oh, now, that wasn't exactly what I meant. He couldn't stand in court and say, well, define if. He had to do what it said. But even though he did, could you imagine? You imagine that next morning? It said the king didn't sleep at night, he didn't eat anything. And early the next morning he gets up and he goes to the mouth of the lion's den. And he calls out, Daniel, was your God who you trust wholeheartedly able to save you? What do you think he was expecting? Do you think, when he took Daniel, he said, I pray your God protects you. Can you imagine the shock on the king when all of a sudden Daniel says, oh king, live forever, I'm here. I bet his mouth was open so far. I bet his eyes was just big around. And he hurried and they got the stone off and he brought Daniel out and it says everybody saw that Daniel was okay. But who got the glory? It wasn't Daniel. It was God. Because Daniel lived his life above reproach. Because he was predictable in his faith. The king sent out a new decree. Sent it all over the kingdom. No matter what language the people spoke, he put it in their language. Everybody needs to live in fear of the God that Daniel serves. Because that God kept him from the lions. Now, I remember one time reading an article that tried to explain some of the great things that happened in the Bible. And I remember in that article it said that probably the lions had been well fed and wasn't hungry. And maybe Daniel was the lion keeper and they knew him. That's not true. Look what happened next. Look what happened when they took those who tried to trick and trap Daniel and their families and they threw them in. It said before they even reached the bottom, they were torn up by the lions. Those lions were hungry. But Daniel served a God who was bigger than all the lions. Daniel was faithful to a God who was in control of the situation. So my question to you this morning is this. Is your life one that glorifies God? And is it one that leads others to Him? Because folks, let's be honest about it. It's easy for us to come to church. It's easy for us to put on our Christian face. It's easy for us to sing the songs that we love. It's easy for us to smile at one another. But then we go out the door. We go home. We go to work. We go to school. We go to the sports fields. We go to the woods. We go to the store. Wherever we go. Is our life different then than it is in church? Or is it the same? When we looked at Daniel's life, Daniel lived his life above reproach. If you were found on trial for being a Christian, is there enough evidence today to find you guilty? Or does something need to change? Daniel was predictable in his faith. Yeah, everybody in church might say you're a great Christian. They might love you. But how about those other people that you know? How about the folks at work? How about the people at school? How about the friends you sit with in class? Or the ones you work with across the line? What would they say about you? Or better yet, this afternoon when you go home, what would your family say is true to you? Are you predictable in your faith? How do you know? You know, because when you are, God gets the glory. And when God gets the glory, others will come to him. So maybe this morning, maybe it's time to quit pretending. Maybe it's time to take off our Christian false face and just present to God who we truly are. Say, Lord, forgive me for my past. We can't change that. All we can do is forgive it. Forgive me of my past. And from this day forward, I declare I want to live a life pleasing to you. I want that life to be the same no matter where I am or what I'm doing. Maybe this morning when our praise team comes to sing our next song, you need to take that time to pray. Maybe you want to come here to the front of the church and make this your altar. Just to say, Lord, I want my life to glorify you. In everything I do and everything I say. I want it to glorify you. And I want, because I glorify you, others to come to know you through me. Maybe this morning that needs to be your prayer. David went to the lion's den, but he proved his God was bigger and his faith was true. How about you? Father God, Lord, I thank you so much for this story and for teaching us how to live our lives. Not as one who is deceptive, but as one who lives for you. God, I pray for each person that hears this message. Maybe here in person today, maybe on social media, or maybe sometime down the road they'll stumble onto it on one of the websites. I pray for them, that their life will be pleasing to you, that they will live a life above reproach, they will be predictable in their faith, that they will glorify you, and others will come to know you because of them. So in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.